Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andreas Sevtsuk. I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of Urban Planning and Design, and we'll be moderating this Cities and Technology panel debate centered around a question: will shared electric and automated vehicles deteriorate or ameliorate pedestrian qualities of streets? This is a series of cities and technology debates we're holding here at the GST this semester, as well as our counterpart debates at MIT that are organized by the Department of Urban Studies and Planning there and the Sensible Cities Lab. There will be more announcements going out about the following debates that are coming up. Just a few words about the speakers today. We are very happy to have with us Seleta Reynolds, who is the general manager of the LA DOT, and is also very active in the work of the National Association of City Transportation Officials, NACTO, serves as the current president of the organization and has been a big streets and public life advocate in the United States in the last decade. We also have Robin Chase, who many of you know, who's a Cambridge local, but a global citizen, the founder of Zipcar and Buzzcar, and has been very actively involved with non-governmental organizations and others trying to steer this future trajectory of the transportation revolution towards a better path. Diane Davis, who is the chair of the Urban Planning and Design department here at Harvard. I'm sure all of you know her. And Diane's recently, or is still in the process of completing a major transportation research project sponsored by the Volvo Research and Educational Foundations called Transforming Urban Transport, the Role of Political Leadership. So thank you very much for being here and joining this debate. Chris Osgood, Boston's chief of streets, unfortunately informed me this morning that he has to take care of snow. So Chris is not going to be joining, very unfortunately, but we'll hopefully have him back for another debate in the future. So I just want to say a couple of words of introduction to this debate and then turn it over to our speakers. The format will be that each of the speakers will make a 7-minute statement around the question. We urge the speakers to take a side, whether the new mobility technologies will make streets better for pedestrians or worse for pedestrians. And some of them will take a clear answer, and we'll see how this plays out. And actually, before we even get into the topic, I'd like to also do a very, very quick poll in the audience, just by a show of hands. How many of you think that the mobility revolution in the form of shared electric and automated vehicles is going to be good for pedestrians on streets? Please raise your hands. Okay. And how many of you think it's going to be bad for pedestrians? I'd say that it's about 60-40. 60% think it's better for pedestrians and 40 bad. We're going to do the poll again at the end of the debate today. Okay. So I'm only going to use one chart to do this introduction and a single slide and then hand it off. This chart comes from the Rocky Mountain Institute, who has, along with many others, been evaluating the economic cost advantages of shared electric mobility. And I think it depicts one of the most important aspects of this transition, which is that on the left-hand side, we have the picture of the cost of mobility today. The greenish line on the top is really the cost of a personally owned car today, and this is total cost, including the operational expenses. Operational expenses alone are on the gray line below. So what we see here is that the TNC ride, so if you ride Uber or Lyft today, then the cost per mile of riding it is approximately the same as the cost per mile of owning a vehicle today. Now, of course, many people don't think of the total cost of driving, so they think in operational costs. How much does it cost in gasoline and parking on a daily basis? And that cost on personal cars is still about half of the TNC costs. So there's a lot of people who use TNCs, take Ubers and Lyfts, but still it remains, in terms of operational expenses, much cheaper to own a car today. Where the Rocky Mountain Institute sees the trend moving by 2035 is the following, that the cost of riding TNCs on automated vehicles, so taking an automated Uber, an automated Lyft or Didi, will be considerably lower than the cost of total car ownership for personal cars, and even lower than the cost of operational expenses in personal cars. This is oftentimes used as the sort of argument about why the industry in automotive sectors, as well as the transit network companies, et cetera, are all banking on a future of shared autonomous mobility, not so much the private model. And this makes an economic case that indeed, if the operating costs are so low, which make a ride cost around 30 cents per mile as opposed to $2, in fact, in some of the cities today, then there's an enormous economic advantage to shifting out of personal automobiles into shared and TNC modeled automated and electric vehicles. So I just wanted to set this context of why this is such a big discussion and why so many of the private sector counterparts speculate that this is going to be a tremendous influence on cities today. But we're not going to be talking about the economic projections and forecasts for this. What we're going to be talking about is what this means for streets, and particularly the pedestrian qualities of streets. So I'll stop there and we'll do the first statement from Seleta.
Okay, Kevin told me I have to do it at the podium, y'all. So I'm at the podium. I will tell you a side story. Barbara Boxer, very famous elected official from California, travels everywhere with what is known as the Boxer Box, because she is in my tribe, the tribe of people under 5'3". And so anytime she's behind a podium, she stands on the Boxer Box so that she is taken seriously by her audience of mostly white dudes. So I don't have a Boxer Box today, but I just treasure and delight in that story. So I am going to put out, I'll say at the top of this that my position on the question is an answer that very frustratingly my favorite high school teacher, Dr. Charles Weeks, used to say when we would ask him questions, which is yes and no, but mostly no. In terms of whether or not we think that future mobility options are going to make things better for people walking specifically. So, you know, it's no new thing that we are dreaming and hoping and wishing and trying to ideate towards a really exciting future in mobility. And all of the disruption that's happening in this space right now allows us to think creatively and to bring words into the conversation about transportation and the public realm that we typically don't get to use. Words like transportation happiness, words like social cohesion, words like public life, right? And this is a project that I did with some artists in San Francisco where politics, money, feasibility is no option. What does the future of transportation look like? And all of us were like, well, I'd like to build a second Transbay BART tube. And the artist said, cool, let's assume that's already done. Now what? And I was like, well, I don't know, maybe a zip line across the bay. And they were like, great, we're going to go with that, right? Which sort of feels like what's happening in mobility right now, which is really exciting, right? And it allows us to take renderings like this, which is the utopian vision of what comes when we really get to this. My favorite summary of the acronym is ACES, where it's autonomous, connected, electric, and shared. We come up ACES, and we get this sort of consolidated fleet and renderings that we bring to life that really surround and orbit around people and public realms that are designed around people's happiness and kind of our basic needs as social creatures, right? And give us opportunities to do all the things we love to do in cities, which is, you know, flirt and make up and break up and argue and debate and people watch, and opens and unlocks the potential of the public realm to facilitate that. And the private sector, and some of them are even singing from the same song. songbook and putting out ideas and visions of the future that look very similar to the ones that urbanists have been talking about for a long time, which is really cool, right? So if we can get to a place where I can open the streets of Los Angeles to people and have a gigantic party that we call Ciclavia every single weekend, what that would mean for the strength of the city and the power of sort of pulling people into neighborhoods that they otherwise would never see and seeing their city in ways that they otherwise wouldn't. What if I could turn a street into a playground at the flip of a switch over the course of the day? What if I could invite families to come out and be together and have opportunities to do more with the streets than just get around? What if I can radically re-envision street furniture for something that is modular, that moves around, that allows people to flip it up, turn it around, sit on it, play on it, and then pack it up and put it away when they want to use the street for something else? But there are very powerful forces that are aligned against these kinds of outcomes. And there's this dichotomy between technologists and urbanists. And you have people with giant brains, although I guess it's not the size of the brain that matters, it's the density of the folds, which I cling to as a person with a very small head, that come into this space and mistake political problems for technology problems. And, you can read this quote that was out in the public space about how sort of the technology side of the house is thinking about sort of the issue of moving large numbers of people in cities and their solutions, which align very much with this kind of approach where you pull up in your private vehicle, you get whisked down on an elevator, and you zoom point to point without having to interact with any of the hoi polloi on the street. And folks who are repeating mistakes that we know happen when you flood the public realm with things that are expendable. For things to last, people have to love them. And for people to love them, they have to be beautiful. So when you give somebody something that is not well designed and is sort of crappy in the interest of giving a lot of them to people, then this is the result that you get. Streets and spaces and things that are not cared for and organized. Because the problem here is that a lot of these private actors and companies are not mobility companies. They are data companies, and they are building new empires on top of a platform that we are absolutely not ready for. And they are not providing sort of a thoughtful approach to the public realm. The other problem is us, right? We've done, frankly, a pretty crappy job of creating and delivering a beautiful public realm to begin with. And when we go into communities and talk about real changes necessary to deliver a beautiful public realm, we get results like this. So this is what happens in Los Angeles when you go into a wealthy West Coast neighborhood, take away a lane of traffic and repurpose it for people biking and walking. You immediately get the community of folks organizing and fundraising to recall the locally elected and to form a PAC specifically designed to combat road diets, right? Which is one of the most important tools that we're going to need in our toolbox in order to enable this really beautiful, well-designed public realm. And the fact is that these changes were made specifically because a 16-year-old girl named Naomi Larson lost her life when she was crossing her street from the beach to the parking lot. Right? And in light of what happened in Tempe, Arizona this week, I think we all need to think carefully about whether or not we are willing to accept fatalities as the price of getting to this full autonomous future that we are all so interested in, right? And the fact that the actors on the private side that are enabling and building the products that get us there are absolutely operating from a windshield perspective. The last thing I'll put on the table is that there was a story that came out a couple of weeks ago about the fact that China is denying entrance into some of its subway systems for people with poor social credit. So I think we also have to think very carefully about the surveillance and privacy questions that are hard-coded into this transportation technology future, and whether or not we are willing to create a new class system based on the fact that our data is ubiquitous. So, and it really is, we are not allowed to evaluate it ourselves. So from my perspective, unless we get real culture change that has to be called for by the public, by academic institutions, by cities, then we are much more likely to end up with a very deteriorated public realm in the future.
I'm going to go really fast because I have a 3.5-minute video, and then I get 3.5 more minutes. So, go. Self-driving cars could make cities more livable, sustainable, equitable, and just. Fully automated self-driving cars will be available for sale in cities by 2020. They have very different economics than our current cars, and so won't fit in well with today's rules of play. I see two distinct possibilities for our automated car future: heaven or hell. We get to choose. Forward-thinking leadership is going to make all the difference. We get hell by taking a wait-and-see approach. In this future, people buy AVs instead of today's cars. For trips, once you get to your destination, instead of paying for parking downtown, it'll be cheaper to have your empty AV circle the block or drive back home. The same is true for stores. It could be cheaper to have a drugstore car drive to customers than to pay for retail space downtown. Today, 75% of all cars on the road have one occupant, the driver. In the future, as we add more cars operating with their different economics, 50% of the cars will have no people in them, running low-value errands or avoiding parking. Meanwhile, all the taxi, bus, shuttle, and truck drivers will lose their jobs. We'll also lose about 60% of our tax revenue that finances road infrastructure, because AVs are electric, don't park, and don't get parking tickets. Our roads and bridges get a whole lot worse. We definitely don't want the hell scenario. We get heaven by taking a proactive approach. Over 1 million people in U.S. cities are already car sharing. And in San Francisco, 50% of the people using ride-hailing apps now share their trips with another passenger who is a stranger. Instead of spending $9,000 a year on your own car, when we combine car sharing and ride-hailing and buy a seat in a shared autonomous vehicle, we can get door-to-door transport at the speed of private car travel for the cost of a subway ticket. This transforms people's access to opportunity. Car sharing eliminates the need for parking. Ride sharing reduces congestion. We will only need 10% of the cars we have in cities today, even at peak times. No more on-street parking, no more parking garages. If most of the AVs in cities are shared cars in which people can share trips. We can widen sidewalks, plant trees, put in bike lanes and benches. We can get rid of parking lots and build affordable housing, or public parks, or whatever. Establishing the criteria and priorities for newly available public land will be critical to making sure communities get what they need. We could also reduce air pollution and CO2 emissions as we move from gas to electric power for our cars, but only if we demand that this new incremental electric energy use be renewable. Happily, electric AVs will pay their fair share for road and bridge repair because we will have made and created new user fees that apply to them. We'll discourage empty zombie cars and make it more expensive to drive than to park. But wait, what about all those people who used to drive, repair cars, pump gas, design, and build cars for a living? They worked hard and their jobs disappeared almost overnight. We need to make sure that people can diversify their income with benefits that are portable and apply no matter how few hours you work. And we need to start piloting basic income. So if we want heaven and not hell, we have to start working together to get the right laws and regulations in place now, especially for the first cities that set the example. Just as your head is reeling from the impact and potential for self-driving cars, realize that this is just the tip of the big automation iceberg. Automation delivers enormous productivity gains without the associated labor. It's like making honey without the worker bees. How will we distribute this new kind of honey? Automation gives us reason to reconsider how, why, and where we tax, and to think anew about what kind of world we want to live in. So I guess my question is, will it be better or worse? I'm going to go for style of debate. Yes, it's going to be great. And then I have a bunch of crummy slides because which always, whenever I give a talk at GSD, I am embarrassed by my slides, but I change them up every day, and I'm not skilled. So I feel like we have this unique and irreplaceable window of opportunity right now. The arrival of autonomous vehicles provides us a concrete and visible time horizon for action, unlike climate change, which just keeps flying out to the future, with a built-in refreshment of our vehicle stock, meaning if we paid attention, we could actually get vehicles to go from being combustion engine to electric, and a host of very focusing problems for all the stakeholders and an opportunity to redo cities. So we have this political moment. And so why do I think it's politically possible? That we have this impending, we're about to introduce autonomous vehicles that are coinciding with huge urbanization pressures around the world, personal car ownership at its demonstrated limits, the negative health effects and cost of our sedentary lifestyle playing out, congestion crossed with the bankruptcy of our infrastructure financing, and the climate stabilization window closing. So these are things that everyone is thinking about, this huge group of stakeholders, and we can bring this together right now. So I feel like we need to use jujitsu to take the momentum of this terrible, all these things happening, and push it to end up the place where we want it to be, this heaven version. And for me, I've been thinking that what we really need to make clear is that among people who are thoughtful about it, there really is one common vision. I think there are these tectonic plates are shifting in the transport sector, and everything is in motion. And we know for sure that the place that we need it to solidify is on the side of livable, sustainable, clean, just cities. And so we have to act at this moment. So I've been working on, and I've just raised a lot of money for, creating this one worldwide collaboration. And it's a preposterous idea. How do you make a worldwide collaboration? And so I think number one is we have to create awareness of the problems and opportunities. Everyone has to see that this thing is about to happen. Two, alignment among as many stakeholders as we can, as here's where we're going. We all are in agreement, this is where we're going. And then local execution is incredibly challenging, which is why it needs this huge collaboration of everyone, everywhere. So part of this work was something I just did called the Shared Mobility Principles for Livable Cities. I'm sorry, this slide's got so much on it. It was creating a common vision of what a city should be, so sustainable, inclusive, prosperous, resilient cities, efficient and pollution-free flow of people and goods while providing affordable, healthy, integrated mobility for all. And this common narrative of how to get there. And these are these 10 principles. I'm throwing them up there. You should go look at it later. What is really fantastic is that it was designed, these 10 principles were people from these large transport and city NGOs got together over 7 months. It was torture, wordsmithing. In fact, we all did agree with these principles. And then 5 weeks ago, we announced that 15 of the large service providers were in, and in that interim month, we've had this huge outpouring from people around the world. So people from 30 different countries, entities from 30 different countries, had doubled the size of these big multinationals that are interested, and a whole bunch of local NGOs. I'm working with C40, and we're going to be hitting up their cities. And really the goal is to have this shared space where we all are saying, this is where we're going, and directionally, this is how we're going to get there, so that we have some very focused areas of agreement and focused areas for discussion. So to conclude, this favorite little diptych of mine, this is the Chungcheon River Highway that ran through Seoul. That mayor decided that he wanted to become president, and he did a really difficult and challenging hard work thing to rip off those 12 lanes of highway and uncover the river that went underneath. This is what it looks like, and he did go on the back of that to become president of South Korea. And I guess what I want to say is infrastructure is destiny, and we have to get this transition right. So whether your thing is going to be hard or near impossible, we have to go there, and there is a beautiful future ahead if we work hard at it. Thanks.
Whoops. So it's very daunting to be on this panel with these two brilliant women who are like national, if not global leaders in the field of transportation. I'm just kind of coming up from the ranks, studying things among which was the political decision to build to tear down the Chongqing Highway, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm returning to the question that Andres sent me a couple days ago. He wanted us to answer the question, are emerging mobility technologies ameliorating or deteriorating pedestrian qualities of streets? And so I pondered over that question for a while, and my answer, and I'm sorry, Andres, is to say it's the wrong question. Or better said, perhaps an overly narrow question that doesn't allow us to get at the larger reason we need to focus on new mobility technologies, which to my mind is their impact on urbanism and the overall quality of the mobility urbanism experience in cities, including the impacts on sustainability and equity. And I do want to say a footnote, it's kind of embarrassing, I'm the one GST person here and I don't have a single slide, so letting you know that. So having, raised questions about the question, I want to try to respond anyway, and not completely avoid answering it. So if I were to try to answer that question, I would say it depends. One cannot make a blanket statement about the impact of technology on streets without putting it into more detailed context. So on what does it depend? These are the set of questions that I'd have to answer to think more about this question. First, which technology? And in particular, collective versus individual, there are a variety of technologies, shared, etc. Which city? I.e., what is the form, the structure, and the nature of the streets in a particular locale? How have they been used in the past, and how will they be used in the future? 3, which neighborhood? Because remember, we're focusing on streets here. There may be other conditions that mediate the adoption and distribution of these technologies. 4, which people use the technology most frequently? And what does this do to non-users on the same street? So those are kind of some of the equity questions. And then 5th and last, who controls? That is, who owns, manages, regulates, coordinates, if only, the technology? And for what purposes are they being deployed? Is it for money making, for mobility, for social cohesion, for mode shifting, for reducing carbon emissions? All of those are valuable goals. But sometimes implementers or promoters of these technologies have one of these aims and not the other in mind. So I want to say that this suggests a focus should be on the conditions under which new technologies are applied to streets, rather than focusing in an isolated manner on the relationship between technology and streetscapes, important as a larger concern is. So one of the things that I learned when I went on the job market, my advisor told me, when somebody asks you a question, always turn it into something that allows you to say what you want to say. And that's my part now. So, of the 5 conditionalities that I just mentioned, I'd like to put on the table for discussion the last one, which has to do with who controls, manages, regulates, or coordinates this technology and for what larger aims. I want to highlight this precisely because advocates of smart mobility technologies do not always concern themselves, and I'm actually not talking about the folks that are here, but I'm thinking about Uber and Apple Car, etc. A lot of these advocates and inventors in smart mobility technology don't concern themselves with the larger questions of governance or coordinating capacity, let alone a larger commitment to advancing long-term sustainability aims. In the current era, promoters of new or improved urban transportation services for cities, IT-related or otherwise, are often, in the best of worlds, focused on the difficult task of challenging the primacy of the automobile and expanding non-motorized mobility alternatives and reducing vehicle congestion in whatever way possible. And that's like kind of, they've got their eyes on the prize, but they're not thinking always about the bigger picture. Again, present company excluded. Sometimes, as has been alluded to, they are just doing this as a measure of profit maximization, not even thinking about the urbanization consequences, but using the language of sustainability as promotion and selling of their products. Having said this, a single change I do involve that the adoption of I do accept that the adoption of these technologies can hold the potential to change the use of streets to make a better pedestrian experience, although there's many sides of the coin, as we've just heard. But also, having said this, a single change in a streetscape may not necessarily produce a better urban experience for pedestrians in a city in the aggregate. As such, the question that might concern us here is not merely the transformation of the pedestrian experience on a given or even a smaller set of streets owing to new mobility technology, but also the impact of these technologies on governance capacities, capable of ensuring that pedestrians in the city as a whole will experience better conditions. And Robin's point about funds not coming to the public sector to answer those questions is one way of dealing with that. For this reason, I want to end my brief remarks not by answering the question, Andres, but by throwing this other, albeit related question back at the rest of the panelists. Will some mobility innovations directed towards changing the pedestrian experience at the scale of the street lay a new or better groundwork for strengthening coordination across multiple sectors, levels of government, planning institutions, or territorial scales, so as to create robust, well-integrated, and environmentally sensitive urban fabric in which the changes individual streetscapes and the pedestrian experience can translate into more sustainable, equitable, and urbanistically preferable cities? In other words, which technologies enable the governance regimes that we need in order to produce those types of cities? Thanks.
Thank you all. So we have a yes and no, a yes and a very academic answer. That's the wrong question. We'll first give each of the panelists time to briefly respond to the other points that were brought up by the other panelists. And we'll go in the same order, have Seleta do the first response, Robin followed by Diane, and then we'll go into a conversation and Q&A.
Yeah. So great, and I really appreciated and enjoyed the opportunity to hear both of y'all's remarks. And also, Andres, thank you so much for being on the panel and for diversity's sake, because I know it's awkward for a man who's on an that has all female panels all over the place, and you just never get away from them. And so it's amazing, really, that the diversity is here. But really, thank you for having me, and it's been a great day so far. And I guess my response is really that that absolutely this is not. I agree with Diane. This is not an external-facing question. It is an internal-facing question for every actor in the space about whether or not they are willing to undergo the kind of culture change in our organizations that will be necessary. And capacity building is one thing, and that's absolutely true. We have to fund each of the things that we want to do properly, but we also have to bust our ways of thinking inside government in particular. So, the way that we interact and work with the private sector has been so frustrating and slow and arduous that the private sector has decided that they're just interested in making government obsolete. And you get a lot of this, I'll call it politely, techno-libertarianism that manifests itself. I will tell a short story. There's a company that will remain nameless that decided to go out and put up their own stop sign, technology company, their own stop sign that blinked on a crosswalk because it was taking the city too long and because our sort of estimate of what was needed was different. And so we walked over there and they were so shocked that I was not there to parade them around the room on my shoulders, but instead to suggest that they had raised and created significant liability issues and actually that we had to take their magical toy down, which just gives you a sense of what we're talking about here. There's arrogance on both sides of this conversation that will have to disappear if we are going to be able to get to the outcomes that we want. And that's really the battle that we should be waging, not so much the battle over even design guidelines for the streets or regulations like congestion pricing. We have to do all that stuff. But before we can do that successfully, we have to completely pivot our way of doing business on all sides.
Some quick things was ACEs are okay, but the one my daughter came up with I really like, fleets of autonomous vehicles that are electric and shared, faves. Let's just be, faves are better than coming with ACEs, faves. So I'm advocating for faves. And I also wanted to be clear as I was looking at my videos and having Seleta watch, I thought, oh, I need to say that when I think about shared mobility, it's from subways up to me taking my own taxi by myself. It's a continuum of vehicle sizes. I'm totally intrigued by what you said, and I think this crosses with Seleta, is the new currency is data, and cities are, I want to say, almost all stakeholders, except for a few, are data challenged. Like most of us don't have visibility, and a few big centralized companies have this visibility. And right now, there's a big discussion waging around what kind of data should be sent to cities in some anonymized format so they can do some quality planning, so they can know where should I do a pickup and drop-off zone, which lanes should become HOV, where are there car accidents? And so that kind of sensor data of all the transport can be given to the city appropriately de-anonymized, and that I would say the private sector, on the flip side, is saying, you cities are asking for everything, you don't know what you want with it, you don't have anybody who knows, have any idea, and you have really terrible handling of it, so you create your own liability issues. And then I would say there's all of us as individuals who are watching all of our data be privatized, and our government in this country doesn't care. So hopefully the Europeans will should put their standards onto us, and that might happen in the future. So I just want to say data is this really interesting space where we could be having a useful interaction among those parties. And I was struck by, I don't know if you guys know GTFS, which is Google started, but became a worldwide standard for transit schedules, times, fares, and that was really interesting. But if you think of the continuum of transportation, it does nothing for, there's no standards for passenger services, right? And so I think that transit is going to be losing out unless, that they don't have enough data, and these guys have a ton of data to improve services. So anyway, there's a really big challenge in there around data standardization. So yes, I think that government is way too slow. And how do we speed them up and keep this other stakeholder engaged, as in humans who live in those cities, and how do we get them involved at the pace required? So I think there's this real pacing issue that is, for me, the most challenging one as I think about everything ahead. This argument I've been having with my millennial children and their peers is, I'm saying, oh my God, climate change and the impacts, we've lost the window for this, and we have months in which to get this window at hand. And they tell me, Mom, people need to empower it, and it has to come up from the grassroots, and we have to build community, and we have to do this from the, and I think, so for me, that is a huge issue as we go forward.
Okay. Well, I just want to pick up this thread. I think it it's kind of unfolding in an interesting way. So I guess I'm hearing from Seleta the kind of one problem we are facing is the lack of conversation between the private sector and local authorities.
And not just conversation, but trust.
Okay, trust. That's even a better way of saying it. And there's probably, I would like to think there's more trust on the side of the government towards the private sector, but maybe not. So that's a huge problem for us in the field, in our discipline. And we haven't really talked about the idea, the notion of public-private partnerships is super big in urban planning, but really in the field of transportation, we haven't talked about it as much as we should have. So I think that's super important, and I think that's the way to go. We can't just say we need more governance, and then you're gonna, especially in this country, you're gonna get pushback from the private sector. So that's the first point, which you've already laid out. The second one, building on what Robin is saying, I actually think the question of data and who owns and controls the data is a big, important public debate that we should have, and that, I mean, not even thinking about Mark Zuckerberg last night and talking about Facebook, but in this week with the death with the car and now this, we need to grab a hold of that conversation, but maybe tie it to transportation, mobility, and environment, as opposed to having it float in the domain of the public versus a private sector, which is a battle that we won't win, because this country and around the neoliberal world, that is a really tough battle. But if we can bring that conversation down to those of us who care about mobility and sustainability and say, we need to have a conversation about who has access to the data, that and how do we share it between the public and the private sector? I think that is a very important conversation. And the last thing I would say about that, I was just last year when I met Seleta the first time in Leipzig at the International Transport Forum on a group on smart mobility. We were in panels. This is a debate in Europe too. It's not even like they've solved the question about who owns data and how it can be used and marshaled for the public good, not for the private good. That's a general concern. Again, we just have to look at the newspapers, but in particular, in mobility, it is the concern about how to kind of get these actors to work together to produce better cities.
So I would like to actually come back to one of the questions or premises that I put up on a leading slide about the costs of transportation fundamentally changing, and argue that in the 20th century, and in fact for centuries before too, whenever we've had a radical drop in transportation costs in any particular mode, we've seen a huge increase in that mode. Basically, lower prices equal higher demand. So paradoxically from this, it sounds like a city with a lot fewer cars will have a lot more traffic on streets. Even though we have fewer personal cars, these cars that are in use are constantly flying around the streets and not just serving the trips that we serve today, but serving extra trips that will come from the new demand from lower prices. So I'd like to ask all of you, I'll put one more thing on the table, is that we've seen cities be hit by surprise when the TNCs came out. And they went to the state level and regulated at the state level, so effectively kind of incapacitating cities from doing much because it's regulated above the municipal sector. What needs to happen now, today, to either design, regulate, or plan for AVs, which are not out yet, and there's many that are probably hitting the market either this year or early next year in competition with each other, so that we get closer to the heaven scenario that Robin talks about. What needs to happen in terms of regulating autonomous vehicles in particular, whose costs will be closer to 30 cents a mile as opposed to $2 today? We're experiencing a huge drop according to those projections. What do we need to do now so that we inch closer to heaven?
So can I poke at that a little bit? So why are AVs going to be so cheap?
First of all, the fleet operation is the sort of model that this projection is based on, that these are run by TNCs and not the individual operators. Second, the elimination of the human cost, which is about 50% of a TNC today, right? And third, they're banking into this estimate the technology development until 2035, that the technologies will simply become cheaper at scale.
So I want to unpack that a little bit, because I think that I hear this a lot, that it's going to be so cheap because you're going to eliminate the human in the loop, basically, which is the cost, and not just for TNCs, but actually for public transit, right? And there's this, sometimes people will get very frothy and excited about how cheap it'll be to do public transit now because you won't have to have a transit operator. And I think that is a false assumption about, and we should think about what kinds of actions we can take in the public sector to make sure that that outcome doesn't necessarily come to fruition. Because I think a transit operator does so much more than just operate the vehicle, right? They help people with disabilities and older adults get on and off what is a lifeline service for that community. They de-escalate conflict. They are a chaperone in the vehicle. They can observe and potentially prevent sexual assault and harassment, right? For women in particular and many vulnerable populations, the presence of a human in the vehicle is actually really essential to being able to access and use that service. And I would argue that particularly as we think about this shared future, you know, as a woman by myself leaving a bar at 1:30 in the morning, I am absolutely not calling for an autonomous vehicle shared with 3 strangers when there is not a human there, when there is not a chaperone there. And so I think, and when I've said this before on panels, men have said, well, we'll just put a camera, or we'll just put Watson on the bus, or we'll just make it so that if you get assaulted, all the doors lock. Somebody actually said this, right? And I think this is a real question about who's designing these services, that they are centering on their own experience as mostly white, mostly male people who can move through public spaces without any kind of fear of or threat of being profiled or assaulted, right? This is a consideration that I think that transit agencies in particular can anticipate and get ahead of, right? We want to preserve the value of those jobs because they are fundamentally tied to the ability of half of our city to use those services. So those transit operators, in order for those jobs to still be good jobs, need to be trained in, you know, conflict de-escalation, maybe advanced sort of medical training to be able to deal with the kinds of populations that they're going to interact with. Maybe there are entertainment companies and others that want to actually invest in that training because a transit operator becomes the city concierge, becomes people's guide to actually accessing a whole host and array of services that they didn't even know was available. So I am not sure that I totally buy that those services are going to get cheap if there's a whole population that won't use them, if there's not a human or a chaperone in them. So I think that, and I think there's things that cities can do. For example, in Los Angeles, I regulate taxis. And so we got rid of the driver exam, which was basically an English proficiency exam, and replaced it with customer service training, and overnight increased the number of taxi drivers who are getting into the labor force in Los Angeles by over 30%, and increased the number of women who now drive cabs in Los Angeles. So I think there are things that cities can do that are not about pricing, which is one of the hardest conversations to have and certainly one of the most obvious solutions, but that are about making sure that the value of the service delivered it doesn't plunge to zero, because I think it's pretty unavoidable that if that happens, vehicle miles traveled will increase exponentially.
Your last sentence is what I think is going to happen. And so taking away public transit that services, depending on your city, 0 to 40% of the trips. What I'm hugely anxious about, which is I was thinking when you showed your slide, that if the autonomous vehicles happen to be electric, which I want to say it could go either way. When I talk to car companies, they're ambivalent. They're going to let people decide. Intensively used autonomous vehicles, they will choose electric. And I was talking to researchers from UC Davis last week, and they're calculating that the marginal cost of moving an electric autonomous vehicle is $0.015 a mile. And so I want to say that if you own your own, we are now in a situation where your decision to take a trip, which we know falls straight down to marginal cost, but today it's marginal cost and my body, now it's just marginal cost. There's going to be this gigantic explosion of trips, for sure, because now, effectively, it is $0.015 a mile. What would you not do for $0.015 a mile? I can tell you, I will never pay for even $4 an hour parking at a parking meter, ever, period. But so for me, I look at it and I think most of our transportation ills stem from underpricing and poor market signals. So we're letting pollution go for free, congestion go for free, ridiculously cheap access to curbs, and our basic infrastructure, as we know. And so I realize I'm saying things that are politically impossible, but we need to start getting at the root causes for our the root causes for our over-dependence and overuse of personal cars. And every time I'm told that's politically impossible, I think, great, so you're just telling me we're going to hell. You can keep telling me this politically impossible, and I'm saying, now you can say profoundly exactly what's going to happen every time you say that to me. So I think we have to do a huge amount more around political engagement of individuals. And, sorry, I'm saying too many things. One more sentence. If you think about the man on the street, and I want to say 98% of people who have any power over transportation. Yes, the person on the street, and 90% of the people who are in positions of power of our transportation authority entities, if you ask them, what do you think is going to happen in the future with autonomous vehicles, they're just thinking, those cars there are swapping out and becoming autonomous. That's it. And none of them are imagining either hell or the heaven scenario, and now they're imagining, whoa, I don't have to spend 18% of my income on my blasted car to get to my work. I can actually spend a fraction of that, or I can have active and safe modes, I can have these sidewalk, play streets. We have to make that vision so that it becomes politically demanding that that's what we want to see in the future.
Okay, well, so Andres, when you ask your question about pricing or marginal costs or unit costs, I start getting anxious because, that's my zone of ignorance and it's not what is my expertise, and I know that's great analysis, but I guess I want to question the question. I guess I think a part of the problem is thinking about transport through the lens of something like cost or unit costs or marginal costs, and not reminding ourselves, and of course people who study that, and it's important to know that analysis, and again I'm saying it as somebody outside the field of action, it's being able to kind of take a step back and think deeply and critique, but I do think that people who look at costs are really thinking about reducing congestion so that, you can make a relationship between costs and what you can anticipate will be the number of vehicles out there, et cetera. But cannot we remind ourselves that reducing congestion should be a collective public good? And once you start thinking that the problem is a collective action issue, when you start trying to solve that by looking at unit costs, individual costs, there's a mismatch in my mind between how you frame the problem and how you want to come to a solution. So I think that you mentioned, Seleta, it's a cultural problem of how we think about mobility and congestion. Mobility and congestion is just not, it cannot only be thought about as being solved by individual units and the aggregation of individual shifts. Getting back to my point about coordination, just let me give an anecdote. I've spent many years with very close friends who live in Paris. We were in graduate school together while I was going there, and I remember one time a conversation about the difference between the United States and, we were living in LA, but, American cities and Paris, for example, and our friend mentioned people in the United States will do anything to save a penny. They don't think about the larger urban experience. So if you live in Paris, you don't, there are no Walmarts in Paris. Maybe there are now, but you spend a little more money to buy your bread every day. There are things that are more valuable than the unit cost. And those are the collective goods and the situation that we're creating. So I don't think those questions have to be off the table, but I want to make sure that we are educating and changing the culture to think about mobility and congestion as a collective action problem or collective good. Last thing I would say about just bringing up Cheonggycheong, if I could. So we studied the MBLE's decisions and I won't go into too much detail about it because I'm already over my time, but the decision to pull down the highway, opened out a whole series of innovations in transportation that he was able to guide and manage and needed to guide and manage. Actually, he didn't care about transportation. That's my view. He cared about real estate development. That's why he took down Cheonggycheong, but that disrupted the bus system, automobiles, et cetera. But the point here is that he was able to manage a shared cost system so the benefits of one like cost benefits in one part of this integrated transport system were shared across other. So if we're going to talk about costs, let's talk about shared costs across vehicles and not focus on the individual unit and mobility costs. And that's another way to both take the serious work about pricing, but put it in a collective integrated system context and not just think about the individual units and how individual consumers are going to respond to that.
I mean, I totally agree. But what we've all been talking about is the fact that we live in a competitive capitalist society in the United States, and there's tremendous pressure on getting goods and services, moving them as fast as possible, and you feel it every time you're driving a car and you're waiting in that turn lane for that gap in traffic. You feel the pressure of the people stacking up behind you, and it will require, the sort of political will comes from the power of the people, and it absolutely will require a different framing of this whole discussion at the ground level. Because let me just tell you that the good people of Manhattan Beach that raised enough money to get that bike lane ripped out were not swayed by arguments of collective good or even by the grief of a family that had lost a daughter at an individual level. So we have a really long way to go in terms of how we organize and talk about as a community this particular challenge. And in that way, I would say that you are firmly part of the field of action, because I think it will require engagement and activism from academic partners, because you have some of the highest levels of public acceptance and credibility among all the actors in the space. I mean, that's survey science right there. And the power that you can help bring to how we tell the story, I think, is why engaging in partnerships like this one are so essential and attractive to me personally, because it is required now for everybody to get onto the field.
I want to change course for a moment to come very much closer to streets and pedestrians, as the question of this debate started out with. And just paint a picture and ask whether you think it's a real problem or not. So during the first wave of motorizations in the 1920s and 30s, we moved from an environment where everybody could cross and walk on streets anywhere they wanted. There was no marked crossing, there was no traffic lights, etc. Within 2 decades, we had traffic lights almost every intersection. We had things like jaywalking. We had crosswalks and zebras painted all over the streets. Now, second, in parallel to this, almost everyone, even though there's so many diverging opinions about AVs, one thing that almost everyone agrees upon is that there must be safer than current human-driven cars. That we need to go down from 40,000 human deaths a year to closer to 0. We now know that it's definitely not 0, that it's at least 1 since 2 days ago, and it probably is going to get worse. So that combined, sort of the effects of automobiles in the first wave of motorization with the safety concerns that are being implemented in the AVs now. Imagine the following scenario. You're driving in an AV down a city downtown street, and every time somebody is close to the roadway, your vehicle stops because there's a pedestrian close by, or there's a bicyclist walking by. And then people know that the cars will stop anyhow because they're mandated by regulation to stop anytime you step on the road. They troll it. They just jump on the road and they just walk across whenever they want. And meanwhile, here's your $100,000 car, and you look to the right, and then there's a guy in the Toyota Prius of 2015 who zooms by and doesn't stop for those pedestrians. So all of a sudden, you're moving in sort of stop-and-go traffic while the human cars go by because they don't have the same regulation, etc. Now, isn't there a huge incentive for the OEMs, the TNCs of the world, to lobby cities to increase, again, regulations on streets so that you end up with fewer pedestrians on streets, sort of what happened in the 20s and 30s? Is that a real threat? Is that a real problem that cities should focus on, or is that a made-up scenario?
I have opinions. I think you said something that I say differently. I think that 13 13 to 21-year-old boys are going to have huge delight in throwing themselves in front of autonomous vehicles out of the gate. I mean, we see it. I was in Edinburgh on a trolley that was going through a major intersection, and school had just let out, and I'm sitting in the trolley, and this boy comes up and slams the window next to my face, making me leap out of my seat. And I thought, yeah, it's going to be these 13, 21-year-old boys who are going to take huge delight. So how do I see it playing out? It could play out the way you're discussing, which would be terrible. I'm hoping that we have no rules that are made just for autonomous vehicles, because then we'll get superhighways, we'll get highways that are only good for cars going fast. And so I definitely don't want us to make things to make autonomous vehicles simple. But I can picture that these are vehicles that are, they do have cameras, and I will say we're all going to become, if people don't like cross-light cameras now, or vigilance, every single vehicle now is taking photographs 360 as they move through the streets. So how I imagine this is going to be resolved, and it's still not a lovely picture, is that, yeah, I'm going to take a picture of that person who, with joy, threw themselves in front of the car. And time number one, you don't do anything. Time number two, you're going to get a warning. Time number three, you're going to get another warning. Time number four, your parents are going to get a $500 ticket. Is that socially bad? I don't know. I feel like maybe it's not socially bad, because you shouldn't be, like, I don't want people jumping in front of my bicycle either when I'm on the street because it's fun. Is there a right to mobility? But I do see that as playing out.
I think two things about that. One is, I think that the people who are programming, the tier ones that are programming and deploying and testing AVs right now, are very conscious of that, and therefore are programming their vehicles to behave more like humans behave, right? It will be very interesting to see how fast that car was going in Tempe, and whether or not it is programmed to speed within acceptable levels, for example. I think it is a real question in my mind why it needed to be an SUV, right, in the first place. And things that the other sort of piece that goes along with that I'm concerned about is that folks in their very expensive high-end autonomous vehicles will insist on exclusive access to certain rights-of-way, right? Because if your Tesla AV is platooning with a bunch of other folks on the freeway, but you all are slowed down because you still have to solve for the 1985 Camry that's puttering along with a human in it next to you, won't be long before you decide that that Camry ought to be, aftermarket AV'd, the same way that we aftermarket smog our vehicles, or that you will have to pay a lot of money to be able to access these autonomous vehicle networks. Those are the outcomes that I'm worried about, along with what I think is something that is a question for us, which has to do with design, right? The design of the vehicles that are allowed into the central core of our cities in the future ought to be lightweight and low speed. And if they are, and they all have to meet those certain requirements, and if you don't, even if you're in a Prius, you have to park it on the edge of where you're likely to interact with pedestrians and get into something that's more lightweight, then we'll solve for this, I think, in a way that will enable a lot of the other outcomes that we want. But that is a huge regulatory lift, and not the kind of regulation that we are accustomed to doing in the United States at all.
Well, let me respond like the dinosaur that I am. Because when I hear, I love the question you asked and the scenario you laid out. I'm listening to them, hearing about that, the cars coming in. And my first thought was, oh, this is a great opportunity for social disruption and mobilization. If we want to stop this, we can jump out in front. We can organize social movements. And I'm thinking a lot of our students will be up. Yeah, exactly. I'm hoping that some of our planning students will be out there too. So then the second one was, this might produce a new form of transport stratification. Again, people that want to stay with their Prius versus autonomous vehicles, built on more by Robin's point. Well, maybe there'll be pressure for separate highways, so building a separate rights of way. And I'm just imagining this dystopian future, and I don't like it. And I'm not sure if we we want to accept this. That's my dinosaur coming out. It's like, I know everyone will say the train is out of the station, every major auto industry, every IT firm is involved in this, but is it too, I hope it's not too late for us to put out these scenarios. It's just, well, okay, but let's think about our skill sets, what we do here at the GSD, even like more, focus groups with laying out, not just focusing, again, the narrow vehicle and the beautiful pictures, but let's lay out this dystopian possibility that is likely to happen if we don't anticipate the 3 or 4 other things that will happen as soon as these are on here. And rather than thinking about that as a problem to solve with the next technology, which is probably the way we're going to go, lighter vehicles, et cetera, is it still a possibility to mobilize some thoughts about the future of the cities that we're living in and try to at least direct it in a way that we'd like to have those? Because this particular set of scenarios is not the kind of city that I want to live in, with like more money for these specialized, highways for the people that are lucky enough to have bought those BMW, blah, 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 et cetera. And, the people can't walk on streets anymore. But if we don't watch out, that those will be the lobbyists who are behind the technology and the firms. They're going to be pushing either the Manhattan Beach communities or the city planners to be changing cities to fit this technology. We have to stop this.
There was this one sentence I just want to throw out there. So for the shared mobility principles, many companies joining, and some of the companies that are joining are writing these beautiful blog posts about why they joined. This small company in Mexico City, it's called Jetty, it's a microtransit company. And they wrote this blog post, and paraphrasing, I thought the sentence was so succinct. It said, while the rich drive their new AVs in luxury, the rest of us will be left to increasingly smaller and more congested areas. Because remember, when I own my own car, because the marginal costs are so low, it's like I bought 7 cars, because now I'm going to be using it for 7 times the distances. So it was this incredibly dystopic, the rich guys go first, and they're going in luxury and sending out all their errands, and meanwhile the rest of us are getting these increasingly tinier little spaces in which to maneuver.
So this is not a question I put out. I'd actually like to open it up for the audience questions, but I would like to say that what Diane said regarding the sort of the need to define a broader vision and not just focus on the sort of technology, fixing technology, and at the same time what Seleta and Robin also said about, in fact, currently the vision of the future city being worked out by car companies rather than a broader public is an issue where I do think that the academia, together with both public and private sector, should play a major role. That somebody needs to paint this heaven vision, and somebody needs to define with equal rigor and equal sort of social credit and to put it on the table rather than it coming out of the car companies of the future. And this is sort of, we've seen this play out in the smart cities debates. I mean, if you've followed what's happening with the smart cities debate, it's sort of product by product, new visions coming out with a very kind of focused idea, but nothing that sort of paints its externalities and effects together into a broader picture of what this means to live in a future city of this sort. So there's probably an important role for academia and public sector to collaborate in this to help produce that vision and get it out there with equal rigor as the OEMs are putting out. But that's not to put it into a question. I actually like to open it up to the audience. There's a mic that goes around. Kevin will bring it over, and we'll take 3 questions at a time, and then anyone from the panel can try to answer those. So please.
Hello. Hi, my name's Jenna. I'm a postdoc at AG Lab MIT. My question is, so now the car can drive themselves, so we don't have to drive anymore. Do you think people will live further away from where they work, where they go? So there was another set of urban sprawl happening. What do you think about this? Was like people's autonomous vehicles' impact on people's mode choice? What's the impact on the residential location choice? And the urban sprawl question. Thank you.
There's one over here. The gentleman on the second row.
So if the heaven scenario looks like a fleet-operated model, my understanding is that would require a certain amount of density, and as we see the increasing suburbanization of marginalized communities. What does that kind of edge condition look like, and how does AV work on, in the suburbs, in rural areas? Yeah, thank you.
Go on all the way back to the end, and then we're trying to keep you fit, Kevin.
He kind of asked my question in a sense, but I'm particularly interested in kind of like the equity implications of that, because you already see disparities in ride-hailing availability, frequency, and cost on top of all of the other rural, suburban, and urban disparities.
Okay. Let's maybe start with these and take another one. Who wants to?
Okay, so along the West Coast, the sort of chronic homelessness that has exploded in the last few years is really evidence of a complete failure to build adequate housing for the tremendous job growth that's been coming to the West Coast for the last 2 decades. And that is really directly as a result of very heavy control, local control of zoning decisions and land use decisions. And so I think until and unless we are going to sort of move that up, take those decisions literally out of the hands of some of the people who already live in those communities. And by the way, anytime a local community has a high level of influence and control over zoning, that community becomes less affordable and more expensive, full stop. So there's a tension between community engagement, involvement, and the outcomes that we're getting in terms of the accessibility and opportunities afforded by the city. So transportation often bears the burden of policy failures in other sectors, right? People have to move because there's a lack of excellence in public education, and they move to get their kids into a better school. Or because we failed to plan for people aging in place, you have to move closer to where your parents are because they're getting older and they don't want to move. And all of these things result in longer commutes and travel times. And if we don't price the value of that infrastructure the same way that we price water or power based on your use, then what we have created is a utility with pretty much bottomless demand being gamed by a system of very poor land use decisions on top of it, which then results in all of these sort of friction points and edge and equity issues that will absolutely spark a reinvigoration of suburban sprawl and kind of these long commutes that people make because they're cheap, right? Because the cost of the infrastructure is totally invisible. So there's some big lifts there, but they're not necessarily all in the world of mobility. And I would say we need to think about a new definition of public transit that starts with, e-bike sharing and goes all the way up to a subway and includes everything in between and has some kind of centralized management so that we stay in the business of delivering public transit as a public good and not for private profit. And the only way we're going to get there is by creating incentives and really being an activist investor on the public side. One of the things we have not talked about at all is the air. And how we are going to think about public rights of way that now extend all the way up to 1,500 feet above mean sea level, and that next year Prime Air and Walmart Air will start using to deliver thousands of goods in the skies over cities, and eventually, if you're wealthy enough, people. So there's a necessary moment for the city to rethink of ourselves and rethink about code as our new concrete and rethink about our role as inviting private folks into our sphere only if they abide by certain principles that we set. And one of those has to be absolutely about the value of that right of way, whether it's above the air or on the surface.
I'm so glad, Seleta, you said this piece about drones. It is one of my nightmares. So just thinking about...
I know. I am also a hobbit from the Shire and totally terrified.
So two small additional points. This piece around sprawl, and I think it's, again, because of underpricing, another piece we've totally underpriced, so it seems really cheap and free. I also think, though, that it's not as though everybody is going to want to decide to live out. Because if you can stay in, one of the reasons I'm staying in is because I want to be able to walk outside and bump into a friend, go have a cup of coffee, do these things unplanned. So it's not, and another reason I'm not willing to commute for 2 hours is because there's someone at home that I actually love and want to see. And so the fact that I'm now 15 hours away and 2 hours each way in transit that is gainfully employed, I'm still that amount of time away from someone. So I just want to say, I don't believe that everyone's going to be moving out. There's some subtlety there. How I think it's going to play out in these in suburban and rural areas, I've been really thinking about it a lot over the last 2 years. So whenever I am in another place, I think, okay, if I lived here, what would be happening now? Because of cultural reasons, I think people who are living in really rural areas, they are not thinking that, yeah, I'm going to pull up an app and they're going to come in 10 minutes and I can ride. They will be owning their own primary self-driving car, I think, for sure. But I do think their secondary car or their third specialty car will be rented from your neighbors. So I think I can imagine that playing out. I've been thinking a lot about equity and access, that imagine you are some small town, population 700 or population 2,000. You could be having your own autonomous vehicle that now can be doing all of that great stuff of taking elderly to the hospital or going to get people to work. That I think you will be able to have a better public transport and facility service. I think that there's some opportunity there at lower cost than it is today to provide better services. It's still a challenge.
I very much agree with what has been said. I'm glad somebody brought up the scary idea of drones. Terrible thing. Andres and I talked at the Radical Amazon Transportation Summit about that issue. Story for another time. But I guess I'm very happy. I think I buy your answer, Robin, that hopefully people won't be wanting to spend 2 hours, even if they don't have to drive themselves, doing their email or whatever. But I do think that what you've put on the table, and Seleta already mentioned it, is what you've put on the table is something we haven't talked about yet, but is central to this debate, which is land use. So, I mean, really, there's a larger framing of our conversation today that I think we all have to be aware of, which is we have to rethink what is land use, what land use in cities should be in the future. As planners and designers, this will include then the streets are part of it. It's no longer just this modernist idea of what gets built on the edge, what's the combination of commercial, residential, et cetera, that in a way the problems of mobility are there because of the disconnect between work and home and because of land use. So just another plea, as in my introductory remarks, for our disciplines to not put our heads in the ground, to be too technocratic and identify a slice of the problem, technology, mobility, without connecting it to the relationship of work and home, land use, et cetera. So I actually think the challenge is to integrate the way we talk to each other as professionals about this question. I think there could be new land use and urban designs that kind of address this problem that maybe wouldn't be thought about by a transport person alone, but that really pull it all together in the physical space of the city. So that's why I do think we have to worry about sprawl, because also one of the, getting back to the equity issue, one of the downsides of some of the innovations in mobility is the more access neighborhoods, land values go up and the poor get pushed out to farther places. So we can talk about that as an equity question, and we should, but that's also about who's minding the store with respect to how all the parts in the whole fit together. And the parts in the whole are the physicality of the the footprint of the city, but they're the infrastructure, and they're who's paying the costs of the electricity, the water, et cetera. I know I sound like I'm asking for a return to this impossible dream of comprehensive planning and the way we thought about physical space, but I do think it's time to start looking at the connectivity across the innovations and the technology, and thank you so much, Andres, for having this series and today's discussion, because it would be a mistake if we just think about this as a problem about technology and technological innovation, and we don't insert it into these larger sets of questions about what are the cities that we want to be living in, and what should they look like, and how should people who have skill sets across different sectoral expertises be talking to each other about it.
Okay, let's take another round of 3 or 4 questions. Yeah, maybe Ricardo.
Hello, I'm Ricardo Alvarez, PhD candidate from MIT. My question is, this week's tragedy in Arizona, okay, is going to give us the opportunity of establishing the first legal case when the legal system is going to digest the liabilities of autonomous vehicles, right? And that digestion is going to generate a series of legal precedents that are going to affect both regulation and adoption. What are the scenarios that you see in terms of those liabilities dispersion and the effects that it could have towards adoption of these kind of systems at scale?
Okay, thank you. Up front here.
I'm curious about the heterogeneity of different laws affecting autonomous vehicles. So imagine if a self-driving car gets stuck, it can't escape the borders because all the surrounding towns prevent it. And how do they know what the laws are for different regions?
Great. I think Arjun. Okay, I'm gonna recite them.
Hi, I'm Arjun. I work for multiple OEMs, so this is super interesting to me. I was just wondering about what your thoughts are. In the US, personal car ownership is super important to a lot of people. The per capita car ownership is super high, and it doesn't seem to be falling, right? We have, I think, close to 800 cars per 1,000 people in the US. So I was wondering how this discussion ties into future personal car ownership and how the rates, do you see the rates falling or do you see the rates staying the same in the future?
Okay, so just quickly to recite. So first question about how does the Tempe precedent of killing a pedestrian set scenarios for further implementation in other cities, and what does that mean for the scaling and implementation of AVs? Second, how does the legal heterogeneity of regulation play out so that we can drive your vehicle across municipal boundaries? And third, how or why would the personal love affair with a car end, given the current trends in TNCs and AVs? And why are all these projections arguing that everybody's going to use shared services? Not necessarily shared cars, meaning other people in your car, but using a fleet car like a Lyft and Uber, even if you're alone in it.
Can I take the easiest question?
Yeah.
If I think about shared cars, which I know something about, when I started Zipcar, everyone said, that'll never happen. Americans love their cars, it'll never happen. And I want to say it's only 1 million people, so it's not endless numbers. And when I went to Europe recently, they said, oh, Robin, yeah, people share cars in Europe, in the US, but in Europe, you don't understand, we have our special relationship with our cars. What I have understood profoundly, I think we see in sector after sector and service after service, is people can say those words, but when something is more convenient and cheaper, like whatever. People follow their wallets every time. They follow their wallets, and if it's a convenient one, it's done. So I don't see that, and I would just, my 15-year-old sentence that I would say is, and owning your own car is way less status than me choosing the car for the trip, never maintaining it, never worrying about a car accident, just paying by the hour. It is a higher form of status for sure. And so that doesn't bother me at all.
So I'll take a swing at the question about heterogeneity of laws, and I think that you're seeing this word becoming a dirty word among regulators, which is patchwork. So the OEMs have been very successful in promulgating this falsehood that a patchwork of regulations is going to hinder innovation. And as a result, the bill that was currently moving through the Senate preempts states and cities from doing a whole host of things around managing system performance, whatever that mushy term means, including things like setting emissions regulations, setting speed limits, doing all of the things that we need to do as cities to manage and operate our streets. And so that idea of preemption being a feature and not a bug of these bills is the response by the private sector in painting that sort of a scenario, right? Our response has always been, look, every time we have tried to write regulations that work nationwide, they fail us in cities and they give us these terrible outcomes. And all you have to do is look at the national standards for street design to see how that plays out and sort of the ugly outcomes for having to apply the same design standards to a rural road that you do to a street in downtown LA. So I think it is going to be important for us to put forward as cities that we have a way to be air traffic control for all of the vehicles that move in and out of our sphere. And I think you can already see in California, the concentration and proliferation of these services is highest and strongest in San Francisco and Los Angeles. So I don't know that you're going to have this granular city by city kind of approach. I do think there's a need for a regional thinking through of this, but I think there's absolutely a way, and the NACTO model is the way that we've shown that you set a national standard, but then here are standards for highly urban areas, and it doesn't have to be that complicated. And I'll just say one beat on the Tempe crash. My concern is that, all you have to do is look at the last 50 years of crash reporting in the United States to get a sense of how that's going to go down, right? Most people in law enforcement and regulation have a strong windshield bias. They are absolutely willing to accept and believe that the fault of that crash was on that woman walking across that damn street at night. And you heard the Tempe chief of police came out and said it, came out with a statement before getting any data that it did not appear that the Uber AV was at fault. Well, you have zero information, but you're ready to right away assign blame to the most vulnerable person in that interaction. When we talk about accidents and we give people fines for negligent behavior that results in injury and death on our streets, what I would love to see is that the liability rests with the product designer, and that product liability is something that starts when the vehicle leaves the lot and doesn't end until it's out of service, because I think we would get much better outcomes in terms of vehicle design, in terms of insurance interference, in terms of repair and releasing back into service, right? When these cars get into crashes, there are zero standards for what the car has to do when you release it back onto the road. These are highly sensitive technical machines now. And so I think that's the way I would love for it to go, but my strong belief and fear is that it's going to go in the other direction, push more and more of the onus and liability onto the sort of cog in the machine that's interfering with the operation of the AVs, which is a human.
I hope we're going to stop getting the questions from the audience soon, because Rob and I were saying, we don't have any more answers. But I do want to say that I think the questions, we want to focus attention on the questions. These are tough questions. I don't have the answers, but these are the questions we need to be asking and having more conversations with more discipline. So one, the law, legal, and I'm sure there's discussions over in the law school, but now with these innovations, there's a whole new set of questions that we have to deal with. So that's my first comment. I'm particularly intrigued by the second question about the jurisdiction, because I hadn't really thought about that. The idea, the possibility, the different municipalities, and maybe this is so obvious because of in LA where, you have this huge sprawling sets of places. But if we start thinking in the tradition of American democracy and institutions, that every municipality, given their class, given their proclivity, what kind of vehicles they want, is going to have a different set of jurisdictions. Because, if it's rich at Manhattan Beach, they will do something different than South Central LA, etc. Now we're getting into a territory that I work in, and that is a huge wicked problem in planning, which is metropolitan coordination. But so what I want to say is, can we turn this into an opportunity? The fact that this might happen, that we might give differences of opinion based on class and race, et cetera, income, about what society wants to see with respect to these emerging technologies. And that might create more fragmentation in the urban areas with legal jurisdictions, problems for the police, et cetera. Could we use that as an opportunity to kind of go back to some of these wicked problems in urban planning that we haven't solved yet, including metropolitan coordination, and use this innovation as an opportunity to do our jobs like we've been wanting to do them? In other words, like not throw up our hands, and which I want to do sometimes, but think, okay, people are interested in this question. Maybe this is the opportunity to talk about coordination across scale, which is something which, as I started out, coordination, when we're talking about mobility and so many other things, investment, land use, equity, et cetera, that is, again, the holy grail of planning. But maybe we can bring it up through this question and reinvigorate some metropolitan coordination agencies with a focus on transit.
Okay, we can take one more batch of questions. Maybe right over here, and then.
I wanted to be a little disruptive and question 3 of the apparent issues that are agreed to in the discussion up to now. One is that it would be bad to make special rules for the new vehicles. I would argue this is the only chance you have to regulate these things. The SUV only exists because of the loophole put into the CAFE standards over a faux populist, oh, gee, the construction workers' pickup truck has to be exempted. And the auto companies drove tanks through that loophole, and now you've got all these SUVs, and you've got factories that make SUVs. Those workers are captive of those SUVs. It's very hard to undo that. So if there were special rules for the AVs, I think that would be a good thing, not a bad thing. So I'm disagreeing with, oh no, we don't want to differentiate. They're awfully strong now. They're going to get stronger. If you don't put strong regulations in now, that's a problem. Second thing I want to question is metropolitanism versus localism. I worked 50 years ago with a lot of people in urban neighborhoods in Boston to stop interstate highways going through neighborhoods and to shift priorities towards public transportation. We were lucky. We won some of those fights. We would have absolutely lost if we had a metropolitan government. We only want, NIMBY is one of the more progressive things I've bumped into in my whole career. It was the building block of local communities saying, you ain't going to do it here, that led to change. And the somewhat uniqueness of what happened in a handful of cities ended up changing what happened in other cities. Ultimately, the Bostons and the Portlands and the San Franciscos got to change the law. So parochialism is not such a bad thing. Thirdly, there seems to be a consensus that rationing by price is the right way to do it. Excuse me, I agree with you, Robin, people pay with their wallet, but some people's wallets are fatter than others. And if the poor are going to be driven out of the cities, which is what's happening, now you're going to whack them again by saying you're going to pay per mile. The most democratic way to deal with, there is going to be congestion. We don't build enough infrastructure, we don't build enough transit, et cetera. So congestion is going to be there. If you ration the congestion by price, then rich people don't deal with the congestion, poor people do. The most democratic way to ration it is to say, hey, you may have more money than me, but I get just as many hours as you do, and I'll stay in this line longer than you, and I'll get to go 15 miles out of the city because you pushed me there by not building affordable housing in the city. So I think there's 3 near consensus items: that price is the right answer, that localism versus regionalism is a bad thing, and that special rules for this new technology would be a bad thing. I want to question all three of those.
Yeah, maybe we'll address these first, and I maybe just also want to clarify on the localism aspect. I heard two different stories. I heard that for housing and land use, that there's criticism that this, in the context of LA in particular, has led to a lot of NIMBYism and land use problems. But on the transportation front, I've heard also that indeed local authorities should have power to regulate and manage strategically situations. So I'm not clear what the message from the panel on that question was, but let's take a step. So the first question was about does AVs need to be regulated now in order to make a change? Second question was about NIMBYism as being actually sometimes good, regulation at the local scale. And third, won't the poor get hurt the most if we start congestion charging by distance?
Fred, let me just answer that first question. I think I started there. I thought, whoa, before there's any stakeholders, before there's any bad business models, let's go address AVs before they get in here. And we're going to say they need to be zero emission. They need to have, pay based on how many people there are in the vehicle. So they need to be based on square footage. All of these things that we wanted to correct. And very quickly, I found out that there exist some very loud stakeholders already. So is it easy? So I'm not finding that it's particularly easier to say, let's just push everything onto autonomous vehicles, and people are going to say, oh, well, I'm not getting one, or it's not happening now, so I'm not going to fight that battle. We know our political system is already bought by big companies, and there's big companies who are in that fight right now. So anyway, I backed off of that, and that's why I feel like we need to address the problems that have ever been. And so fair user fees across all modes is something that I'm really fighting for right now. And that includes autonomous vehicles being treated in the same way as I would ask a personal car owner or a transit authority or a bicycle. Anyway, fair user fees across all modes, which we do not have a level playing field now. And that's taken away the huge animosity that I was, Waymo is not a small company, and Uber is not a small company, and GM is hoping to do, sell. So anyway, they're not small. They exist.
Yeah, and if you feel that way, write your reps, right? Because we're not making, it would be great if we could do a slightly modified version of regulations for autonomous vehicles. That is not the bill that is moving through the United States Senate right now. And there are only 2 or 3 California electeds that are holding the line on that bill passing because of the very loud complaints by organizations like NACTO, by cities, and by states too. They're getting cut out of this game also, being able to serve their normal function. And so there has to be more of a groundswell of electeds that are hearing something different in order for them to pay attention, because I agree with you. Cities and states and however you define that, still have to be able to play a strong role in order to avoid the kinds of outcomes that we've seen on the sort of traditional OEM side of the house. So it's true. I think we're trying to be opportunistic and ruthlessly pragmatic and attack a problem by turning, enemies into allies, because we are butting up against a real brick wall. US DOT, when I was there a couple weeks ago for a listening session on AV regulation, the deputy undersecretary at the US DOT said the only things that we care about when it comes to transportation is we want to go as far as we can, as fast as we can, as cheaply as we can, right? And basically whenever we want. That's who's writing the rules for autonomous vehicles, right? So there has got to be a different vision, a different idea. So I don't disagree with that assumption at all. I think what you're seeing is a kind of a multi-pronged strategy to see where we can get traction and get to some of the outcomes. I think the pricing conversation is tricky because there are absolutely equity issues there to be unpacked and dealt with. And the way I think about it is, Los Angeles passed a sales tax measure that will raise $120 billion for transportation over the next 40 years. How can I take those funds that are under my control and invest in offsetting the prices for some of these new mobility options broadly across neighborhoods, and how can I nudge those choices and opportunities to the neighborhoods where it isn't going to go on its own, right? These private actors are going to go to where the money is, Venice, Studio City, Century City. They're not going to go to South LA and Boyle Heights and Pacoima. But I can use the dollars at my disposal to nudge them in that direction, and I can think through the pricing question, hopefully in a way that that does allow you, if you are in a higher capacity transit vehicle that needs strong access to a reliable point-to-point network, that trip is cheap or basically free for you. And if you want to be by yourself in your luxury internal combustion engine vehicle, that trip is going to cost you a lot more, right? So how can I sort of use all of the pricing strategies at my disposal to directly deal with racial and socioeconomic equity?
Yeah, I mean, I could never disagree with Fred Salvucci. So first of all, let me say that. So but I think that I want to say that I didn't support the pricing one. So we weren't uniform on that one. The special rules for new vehicles, I hear what you're saying, and I think it is important because maybe we can't wait for the right moment, and the field is changing dramatically, or the terrain is changing, and so if we need to start actually having a discussion about regulation, special regulations for these vehicles, I'm supportive of that. I guess the metro issue versus the local, I think that's an open question. And I think that we need to be thinking about at what scale are we going to be thinking about? We're talking about mobility after all. So, it by its very nature is about changing usage across the physical scale of the city. So I think you have so much experience in Boston, and maybe local determination is good for some issues and not other issues. I think it's an open question, but I'm inclined to think about the larger physical scale of the city because I think that's related to sprawl. Transport is all about movement around space. I think if I could just build on what Seleta said, that's terrifying to hear about your meeting and the federal DOT, but I think that also puts on the discussion here the question about the scales of governance. Where are these decisions being made? I think we have to think what's going to be determined or not at the local, at the metro, and then at the federal. This is the open question. And if decisions are being made out someplace else, because that's where the direct influence of the automobile companies is, and it kind of filters down, that's a problem. So at minimum, I'm not going to go to the wall about the local versus the metro. I do think understanding how changes happen and regulation in physical space is absolutely the starting point for thinking about transport. You can't think about it any other way. How that works, whether there's equal shared responsibility, how those agencies, those so-called metro coordination bodies would work, who has power, is there any democratic accountability? Those are huge questions, which people who study metropolitan coordination are still trying to work on. But I am not shying away from understanding the strengths and weaknesses of solving or dealing with this problem at a very local level as opposed to different scales. I think we have to address it.
Great. Well, I think we should wrap up. The speakers will be around maybe for a few minutes if there's any burning questions you want to ask the speakers personally. I do want to thank you all for coming and being on the panel. And also great thanks to Kevin Chong, who had to run out, but he made the sort of logistics of this possible. So thank you very much for being here.